When you load data using Power Query into Excel from a variety of systems or files or databases, you often encounter what we call dirty data. And dirty data can be very overwhelming because it's in such a state that you become frustrated and think, how am I going to get this to report effectively? And this is where really Power Query steps up. Power Query takes dirty data, transforms it into what they call clean data. And it does this with some really powerful features, being able to perhaps manage columns, remove columns, rename columns, being able to manage rows and remove and rename those, being able to organize tables and delete unwanted duplicates, being able to break complicated columns into smaller, simpler and more readable columns, and being able to replace unreadable values with easy, relatable values. So you can really shape your data and transform your data with some really powerful features in Power Query. So let's have a look at a particular query in Power Query called the bike products by month. Now this was a text file, a CSV file that we imported into Power Query, and you can see that it's yucky. It's not very nice. And when I look at the steps on the right hand side, basically the source just shows the data and where it came from, and I can see this up here, that it came from a certain location and was a CSV file. And the changed data, or changed type, sorry, is it changed some of the data types but really didn't make an impact. We need to step in and transform this data using Power Query. First thing I want to look at are the rows. I can see I've got a row at the top which once upon a time was a heading. Then I have a blank row 2, and then I have a descriptive row 3. All 3 of them I don't need. So what can we do to reduce rows? We can use these 2 buttons here, for example. Now we've got 2 choices. We can say keep rows, and we can keep a certain number of top rows or a certain number of bottom rows, or keep rows within a certain range. We can keep duplicates and we can keep errors. Everything else will be deleted. I tend to lean more towards remove rows. That makes more sense for me. So when I go remove rows, I can say how many top rows I want to remove, or how many bottom rows I want to remove, or I want to remove alternate rows, maybe every second row is a blank. Or I want to remove the duplicates and I want to remove blank rows, or I want to remove errors, all sorts of powerful remove row features. Now what we quite simply want to start with is removing the top 3 rows. So I go remove rows, top rows, and I'll bring this little window into view. How many rows to remove from the top? Well, that would be 3. And okay. I have now got a 3rd step in my applied step, which is to remove rows, and I can see the top 3 rows have now gone. Now, in the applied steps, if I want to undo that, I can hit the X, and it undoes it, because there is no undo button. It's sort of superfluous. So what we do is we actually delete the step, and that's how we undo something. If I want to redo it, I simply go back to remove rows, remove top rows, and again, I'll tell it to remove the top 3, and okay. So to delete a step is simply a matter of going to the step and hitting the little X on the left-hand side. If I want to investigate the step, then that's the cog. If I click the cog, it basically tells me that there were 3 rows that were removed from the top. And so I can cancel that. So the cog is to investigate the step, the X is to delete the step. You can even rearrange them by dragging them up and down, which we'll do later. And the other thing is to start getting used to looking up here, and this also tells me the top 3 rows were actually deleted. All right, so we've removed some rows, which is great. Now let's have a look at the first row. The first row, with the exception of the first 2 columns, contains the column headings January, February, March, April, May, June through to December. So what I want to do is I want to promote this first row to being a column heading, and that's what this button here does. Use the first row as headers. If I click that button, January, February, March have been lifted up and are no longer considered a record, and they are now column headings. And that's this particular step here, promote headers, which really should be underneath. Oh no, it should stay there actually. What happens is sometimes you do one thing and it does two steps. So we did promote the headers, and as a consequence, it changed some of the data types to reflect the nature of the data. So that I don't actually want to delete, that's part and partial. Okay, so now we've effectively used the first row as column headings. Likewise, I could turn around and say, use the headers as a first row. So I could do the inverse and say, actually, I don't want those headers as column headings. I want them as the first row of data. So these are the inverse of each other. And we'll leave it at that. Now, we have managed our rows and we've promoted our headers. Now I want to look at columns. Now, before we get into removing columns and managing columns, which is this group of buttons here, we need to know how to select columns. Now, selecting a single column is just a matter of hitting the column heading. That's really, really easy. And if you've got a ton of columns in here, you don't want to have to scroll for a long time to select a column. You can use this button, choose columns. And so I could go to a column, and particularly I could go to, say, the December column, which is at the end, and OK. So that's a quick way to go to a column. And I could choose columns, go to a column and say, actually take me back to the first column, and OK. So that's a quick way in a large number of columns. If I want to choose every second column or just specific columns, hold your control key. Your control key will allow you to click this column heading, and I've specifically chosen those three columns because maybe those are the three columns I want to remove, and I would be able to do that using the Remove Columns button. But what if it was a range of columns? Then I would click the first column and shift click the last column, and that is a range of columns. And then I could perhaps remove the columns. But in fact, I don't actually want to remove any columns. But I want you to know how you select columns, and I want you to know that this button exists. If you were to click that button, it would remove the columns you had selected, whether that be one column or many columns. And if you went for this option, it would actually remove all the columns except the ones you had selected. So that might be handy as well. So be aware of that button. Okay, and then the last thing I want to look at in this particular video is renaming columns. If I want to rename a column, for example, there's a variety of ways you could do this. I want to call this column here Bike Product. Actually, hold a minute. Actually, I would like to remove a column. I'd like to remove this first column. I'm going to click on this first column and simply click the button Remove Columns. And it says, are you sure you want to insert a step? Oh, now because I'm sitting where I'm sitting in this list of applied steps, it wants to insert it there. Cancel, click on the last step because I want the removing of the column to be the last step. And then I've got my column selected, and then remove the column. And so that becomes the last step. If I happen to be sitting here, it'll put the removing of the columns inserted into the steps in there. So you're going to be sort of sitting in the right place. So I've removed the first column, and now what I want to do is rename this first column, and I want to rename it Bike Product. Now you could click it, in fact double click it, and you could rename it and enter. If you find that a bit yuck, you can press F2, the function key. That lets you edit it. Another way is to right click and rename the column that way. Rename, there's the option there. So there's a variety of ways that you can actually rename a column. Right click, double click, or F2, or even if you go to transform in the ribbon, you have the option also here to rename the currently selected column. But I actually think the quickest way is to press F2, which is a little bit of a shortcut from Excel, which means rename. Okay, and that is managing our columns and managing our rows.